I believe I'm live. Welcome, everybody. And my mic just popped off, so that's a good way to start. Clip that back on. While we're waiting for everybody to connect live and get through the ads, for example, let me quickly, a little shout out to Peggy Baker, one of our longtime freaks and supporters. Peggy, I'm going to sing you a little birthday song, if you don't mind, just to get us started. So everybody can join. Just sing at your computer screens or your phone screen or whatever along with me, and we'll wish Peggy a happy birthday French style. Here we go. Joyeux anniversaire, joyeux anniversaire, joyeux anniversaire, Peggy Baker. Joyeux anniversaire. Woo! Happy birthday, Peggy. You are an awesome member of this community, and I can't think of a better way to start this episode than with singing to you. I'm so glad that you joined us today, along with all the other folks who are with us for episode 116. And this is going to be a cabaret episode, so maybe it is fitting that I started by singing. And I'm just going to give everybody one last second. If you're watching this on the replay, maybe you can jump forward just another 30 seconds or so to get to the beginning. Peggy says, I'm completely touched. I love you all. Aw, thanks, Peg. We love you right back for sure. So, all right, I think you're all here. Thank you, everybody, for joining. This is going to be a fun episode. I've been looking forward to this one for a long time. In fact, I would say it's been even a couple of years that I've been waiting to share this story and just dive in deeper into the magic that is the cabaret of Au Lapin Agile in Montmartre. I know a lot of you know it and love it and have perhaps visited it. Certainly have walked in front of it when you're in Montmartre. Thanks, Bob Kolinsky, my friend. He says, awesome, Corey. Wow, he sent me a $5 bill, sent me one of those Lincolns just for the birthday song, apparently. Thanks, Bob. I appreciate you, buddy. And don't worry, Bob. You let me know when it's your birthday, and I'll sing to you live in front of my internet audience anytime. So yeah, what else? Oh yeah, speaking of Bob's donation, super chats are available. If you're watching live right now, it's a great way to support the cause. Also, you'll find other links in the description as usual. Things like my PayPal info for a one-time donation and my merch store and my Patreon link and on and on and on. I know most of you already know that, but there are always a few newcomers and you gotta get them up to speed. John Wood says, I've seen the outside, but never the inside of this place. Yeah, that's why I thought this was really great. I snapped some photos while I was in there viewing a show, because you can attend an old school cabaret show in the Lapin Agile. And this thumbnail that we're looking at here is a very famous painting related to the cabaret by Picasso, and we will certainly get into that because I've always loved the story of this painting, and in researching this episode I actually got to go a little bit further into the magic of this image, and so that's going to be one of the welcome tangents or historical detours that we're going to veer off on, because I didn't want to just talk about what it was like to go see the show, but of course it's a great way to open us up to all of the intriguing anecdotes that are related to this iconic address. So let's get started. I think we've got nothing left to do but jump in. Laura Poffenberger says, I want us to dress like this couple when we go. I would love to see that. We're going to talk about this couple. We're going to talk about all three characters that are seen in this painting. All right, let's get started, folks. Episode 116, Au Lapin Agile, and my night that I spent at it, visiting the show. So here we go. Start with the old Google Maps. This gives you an idea. If you don't know, Montmartre is to the north of Paris, and that little red flag is exactly where we are. Au Lapin Agile, the Agile Rabbit, and we'll talk about that name a little bit later. Here is I'm going to mix in my photos, but also some good old-timey black and whites. And I know many of you have some prior knowledge of Au Lapin Agile, and we're just going to get the rest of you up to speed really quick in a nutshell. This is considered the oldest cabaret in Paris, on a quiet little cobblestone street in Montmartre. It's not so quiet in the summer, I guess, when the tourists roll by, but still very charming, very quaint. Started around 1860, and it started out going by many different names according to the different owners that came through. It was called the Rendezvous of Thieves at one point. It was called the The Cabaret of Assassins had another date. By the late 1800s, it became the Lapin Agile, or the Agile Rabbit. And it got that name after the sign that was placed here. And I'm going to zoom in for us and show you the actual signage. This is from the Musée de Montmartre. The original is hanging on the walls of the Montmartre Museum that I did a previous episode on. I forget which number it was, but for some of these things that I'll reference today, these bits of history, you can also complement by going back in time on my YouTube channel and just do a quick search for the Musée de Montmartre. So this was done by, this Agile Rabbit, admittedly, was done by an artist and writer by the name of André Gille. He was more of a, I said writer, he's more of a caricaturist. He did some very famous caricatures, and he was also a damn good painter in his own right. And André Gille, Gille being his last name, was a big fan of a dish that they served at the Lapin Agile cabaret, and it was a sautéed rabbit dish in a casserole, in a pot like we see here. And he was such a fan apparently of that dish that he decided to paint this image in honor of the cabaret that was not yet called the Agile Rabbit. But he painted this, and it was so well done that they used it as the main signage of the cabaret. And eventually the cabaret became known as the Lapin Agile, or the Agile Rabbit. Now there is a double meaning to that name. Some of you may have heard this. I always find it very interesting. And I made this little slide for us. So let's say Mr. Gille, André Gille, paints this sign, and everyone starts to call it Gille's Lapin. And this first line is how you would say that in French. When you use the letter A like this, it would mean belonging to. So the Lapin being rabbit, belonging to Mr. Gille, Lapin Gille. And you can see it wasn't too hard for, eventually after people said that many times, people's ears just heard, instead of Lapin Agile, they heard Lapin Agile, the Agile Rabbit. So that's the double meaning, or I guess you could call it a jeu de mots in French, a double entendre. So that's how we got the name Lapin Agile, and it stuck. And of course, it's what we're still calling it today. Thanks so much, June Parham. I see your support in the chat. I really appreciate that. Great to have you here. Love having June around. So this was done, this painting by Mr. Gille, and he was, I'll just go back to that. If you ever looked at this, I mean, we can really zoom in. It's very, very well done. The fur of the rabbit itself, he's got a cummerbund here and a beautiful bow tie and a lovely collar flipped up. He's got a worker's hat, a hat of les ouvriers. And keep that in mind, the shape of this hat, because that'll come back to us in just a moment. And of course, he's balancing a wine bottle. I always thought it was interesting. He's balancing the wine bottle on the back of his paw rather than his palm, as it were. I thought that was rather interesting. And of course, we know we're in Montmartre because of this beautifully rendered windmill. And then we've even got a couple of lovers here. We've got a couple tucked away in the back. And this paysage, or this countryside that you see, is very much indicative of what Montmartre would have looked like. It was very sparse, just these shanty villages all around. And there were now it's not the case, but on the butte of Montmartre, or the hill, there were many areas that were rather sprawling and rustic and rural, like the countryside we see here. So I mentioned that he was a good painter in his own right, André Gille, and I want to share with you just one painting I came across done by the same artist, and this is called Le Nouveau-Né, or the Newborn, and this is a self-portrait of André Gille and his newborn son, and obviously his wife, and it's beautifully rendered, just gorgeous. And this time of the mid to late 19th century was really, for me, one of the great golden eras of very realistic representational painting. And I love it. And the reason I pointed out the hat of the rabbit earlier is he's got a very similar hat here. And I just wanted to share that with you because as a tour guide, of course, I've brought people in front of the Lapin Agile all the time during my tours of Montmartre. And often we guides touch upon the fact that the rabbit sign was painted by Gille and blah, blah, blah. But we never really consider what else this artist did. And so you may want to look into that. Not only did he do this, but he did some very, very famous caricatures of people like Charles Dickens and Victor Hugo, and they were published in the very popular humorist newspapers and magazines of the era. So this is, in fact, to some, considered a bit of a self-portrait of Gille representing himself as a rabbit with the hat, and also representing the dish that he really preferred to eat at the Lapin Agile. They no longer serve food at the cabaret, so when I went, personally, I didn't get a chance to try this rabbit, although you know me, I would have definitely done that, just to keep things authentic. Jennifer Robinson says, amazing light captured in this painting. Yeah. A lot of you are fans of that painting. That's great. Great to have you here, Phyllis Cartwright, by the way. Phyllis, who's gearing up. She got the go-ahead. I'd like to say she got the green light to travel to France, but technically she got the orange light, but that's good enough. She got the orange light to travel here in June, coming up real soon. And so I know Phyllis is excited about that. She's going to be pretty much one of the very first of our community that's going to come back into Paris post-pandemic. Maybe we shouldn't be that optimistic to call this post-pandemic, I realize, but, cautious optimism. So let's move on. So the most famous era of the Lapin Agile was in the early 1900s. This photo was taken in 1905, and it's one of the very, very rare images that we have of the interior of the cabaret during the absolute heyday, the iconic era that we always dream about. One thing you'll notice right away is the room was very small, and you'll see that in my own photos that I'll share later, where this room, you walk in and it's meant to house a cabaret show, and you realize that it's very tiny, very cramped, very cozy, very intimate. So that was one of my biggest takeaways, not only seeing this photo, but certainly walking in physically into the space myself. So it was run by a man who, you want to remember his name for the purposes of this episode. This guy right here with the guitar, his name was Frédéric Gérard, and people called him Frye or Le Père Frye, Father Frye. And he was the most iconic manager of the Lapin Agile, and he was there for many, many years. He's the one who really turned it into the mythic address that we think about today. He ran it with his wife. I don't know if his wife is in this crowd. There's even someone hiding, trying to find the lens of the camera, but not quite getting there. I don't know if that's his wife or someone here. But ran it with his wife, who happened to be a very good cook, and so she was probably the one cooking up that rabbit dish, among other bits of French cuisine. So this became under Frye, that we see with the guitar. He always had his guitar in hand, or a violin. Under his management, it was really the pinnacle of what the Lapin Agile would become, and it became known for its rustic, no-frills vibe. Sawdust on the floor, and anything-goes bohemian atmosphere, usually fueled by cheap alcohol, good food, a bit of opium thrown in there for good measure, always a live performance. So there'd always be French folk songs being performed, or cabaret tunes, or drinking songs accompanied by piano, or often Frye himself on guitar or violin, as I mentioned. There would be poetry readings or comedy routines, one-act plays. And when you go through the roster of the people who would hang out here night after night, for some artists it was their main hangout. We're talking Renoir, we're talking Matisse, Cézanne, Toulouse-Lautrec, Modigliani, Braque, Picasso, who we'll talk about in a moment, the philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, and on and on and on. So it's really, really impressive. I don't believe any of those names are in this particular photo, but it's really, really, just gives me chills to think about that. Certainly gave me chills to walk into this room and spend time. In fact, when I visited the cabaret show, I happened to sit right here. And this is 1905, so let's see, I went probably 1905, probably 112 years later. 112 years after this photo was taken, I was sitting right here in the corner, attending a show, so that's pretty fun. So we'll come back to this in a moment. But you got to imagine, packed with artists, on any given night, you'd have writers and dancers and painters, as well as the local laborers and the petty criminals and the women of the night, and they were all mixing together and mingling, performing in front of each other, sharing theories and philosophies. In the wee hours of the Lapin Agile, when things would settle down at 2, 3, 4 a.m., sometimes it would descend into a raucous playground of arguments and brawls and even gunshots. There are stories of people firing guns to get people out of there. Other times, the evening would finish with the audience passed out and sleeping under the tables. I would imagine, as friendly as Frye was as a manager, he was a very cordial, amicable guy. amicable guy, rather. He was, he'd probably let them sleep under the tables if they were his friends and then wake them up with breakfast the next morning. Either way, it was the creative hub of Montmartre. Maybe in all of Paris, maybe in all of France and all of Europe. I mean, was it an exaggeration to say it was the hub of the art world on the planet? Anyway, let's move on. This is what it looks like today via Google Street View, actually. Haas Manning, who is an actor in New York, he says, artists, LOL. Yeah. Nexus Server chimes in saying, Eric Satie used to hang out there. Yes, he absolutely did. And there's a piano inside this cabaret, and of course that's what you listen to during the show. And it was great to think of Satie playing the piano in this room. So for years I would during my walking tours, I would bring people here, like almost every tour guide does, and I would talk about the fact that it used to be a historic cabaret, and still nowadays you can attend a show. It starts at 9 p.m. and goes into the wee hours, and costs 28 euros, at least when I went a couple of years ago. And that includes the show and one free drink, which we'll talk about later. But I would come here year after year and tell visitors about this place, but I felt guilty that I had never attended a show myself. So a few years ago on a very cold December night, I went with my mother-in-law of all people, because she, of course, knowing that I'm a tour guide, she and I, for some reason, the subject of the old cabarets and the ganguettes of Paris is a subject that we've always been able to connect on. And she's always excited to tell me about addresses that she likes to go to, or, the history of her father and the places he would go to. So she invited me a couple of years ago to go with her and a couple of friends. So I said, absolutely. So when you enter, this is, first of all, we arrive, again, 9 p.m. is when it starts. I don't know what's going on upstairs here, because you're not allowed to go upstairs, but you can see the lights on up there. It was freezing cold, so we were more than happy to get inside and warm up. And the very first thing you see when you arrive for the show is a couple of things. First of all, it's very dark inside, and it's very red. Very dark and very red. But what's really cool is you're greeted by this older gentleman here who is the current owner. His name is Yves Mathieu, and what's really fun is, it turns out he's related by marriage to Frye, the guy with the guitar who was managing over a century ago during the Heyday. So it passed down from Frye to his son, and then from his son into the family that this gentleman was married into. So Mr. Mathieu, Yves Mathieu, is usually, at least in the case when I was there, is the guy who welcomes you and takes your ticket and whatnot. And here's another shot of that entrance. As I said, very dark and very red is the theme. But it's so exciting when you walk in. And it's probably hard to make out, but there's sort of some paraphernalia here, or a mini gift shop where you can buy books about the cabaret, and I think some CDs as well. And then before we get into the main room where the performance happens, these are just some quick snaps that I took. And these are all iPhone photos in the dark, which never a good performance situation for an iPhone, but I just, I didn't want to do the tourist thing and pull out a real camera. I didn't even have one in my possession at the time. So this is kind of fun, all the pots and pans. In fact, related to the pot that we saw the rabbit jumping out of on the signage, I think that's pretty fun to imagine that maybe some of those rabbit dishes were cooked in these same copper pots. And so that's one room that I saw. Another room, I caught a glimpse of all the musicians with their cases, mostly guitars, and there's a violin case there. And this is a theme you'll see in all the photos, that it's just all the walls are plastered with artwork. Sometimes original pieces, sometimes copies of pieces that would be too valuable nowadays. But we'll talk more about that for sure. This is a very dark image, but it just shows you that there's also some old authentic paraphernalia and objects hanging on the walls. This being a bedpan, I'm sure you've surmised already. And then this is, what I love is where they would put the hot coals in there and warm up the bed. I love that idea. I would love to try one of those. And then you walk into the main room, which is the room that we saw in the photograph earlier. And as I said, very dark and very red. In fact, so red that I decided when I was prepping these photos that it was a little too distracting. And I don't know about you, but for me, looking at photo after photo after photo of this red blasting your eyeballs, I decided to switch all of my interior photos to black and white, which at least lets us relax a little bit and check out what's going on. So for the rest of my personal photos of the interiors, know that they're going to be in black and white, but it's just me removing the very intense red that that the camera picked up. Pam Moore says, at the risk of repeating ourselves, wow again. Rachel Wyatt says, this place is full of gems. Corinne loves the pans. Yeah, I'm glad that you're all... See, this is why you're my clan. It's because we're all into the same random little treats. Thanks, Leslie Wolf. I appreciate the support. Leslie says, always a wonderful tour, Corey. Thank you. I appreciate it. I thought it was going to rain today. In fact, all week long, it said rain in Paris on Saturday. And it turns out it never rained. So that's the way it goes. But that's why I'm here doing a home edition. I thought it was going to be too wet. So here's another view of the same room. Frye, the manager back in the day, covered the walls with, as I said, all the art of his friends. And he had some pretty amazing friends. And so that's what the interiors give to you at first. Knowing the show was about to start as people are filing in, I decided I probably only had 5 minutes to run around and snap all these shots. And so that's what I'm doing here. That's the piano. No guarantee that it's the original piano that Satie would have played. Probably not. Although I understand that in the Musée de Montmartre, which I did the episode about earlier, that piano in the museum, I read one account that Eric Satie would have played the one in the museum, which is pretty lovely. Here's another shot here. I didn't get any better shots of these, but they look like proper paintings. And again, it was so damn dark in there, I couldn't even figure out who signed these paintings and who they're by. But it was exciting, nonetheless. So hopefully for those of you who have always wondered what it looks like inside, this is a bit of a discovery for you. Next, one of the more striking decorations is this plaster sculpture of Christ, crucified. Turns out it's by a very obscure, unknown English sculptor by the name of Wesley. And I'll show you another view here. And what's fun here is we get our first good look at not only the Christ in plaster, but right to the left of it, this very, very famous Picasso painting. Or what is now, of course, a copy of the Picasso. So we're going to go back to that old photo that I showed you earlier. I want you to note the plaster Christ here and then the Picasso circus performer painting right next to it. And we're going to go back to this same photo. And this is where it gets really fun. I don't know if you noticed the first time around, but here we've got the same sculpture and very faint, you can make out the Picasso painting. And what I love about the painting here is this is something that Picasso hung himself on the wall in 1905 that he painted for the owner, Frye. And if you look closely, I believe it's not even on stretchers. So it's just a rough piece of canvas, which makes sense because when you're a starving artist and you're broke, you would save your wooden stretchers for your more professional work that you were trying to properly sell on the market. And so you would have most of your paintings rolled up or stacked up on the raw canvas, as it were, rather than stretched properly. So I think this is fantastic that you can see it was in its very original raw state. Lily says about the Christ sculpture looks like something from Pompeii. Yeah, you're right, Lily. That's right. I've been lucky enough to visit Pompeii, and you're right. Those plaster casts that they've done of the victims, it looks very similar, doesn't it? Now, I want to note that it wasn't just what we see also in this image. It wasn't just Christianity represented, but over here we have a Greek goddess, and then over here we have a Hindu deity. So on this on this wall, clearly there was something about the, a message about the inclusion of different religions, different beliefs, and certainly I'm sure that's how Frye was running the cabaret back then. So let's zoom in on this painting, the Picasso, because this is fun. And then we'll get back to my photos and my experience of watching the show. I've got a clip of the actual show of a performer that night when I was there, so that'll be fun. So we'll zoom in on this very famous painting. And it's called, quite simply, Au Lapin Agile, done by Picasso in 1905. It was an interesting time for Picasso. At that time, he was living and working in the Bateau Lavoir, which was nearby in Montmartre. I know many of you know it. He was transitioning famously from his blue period to his rose period, where everything was painted in a palette of blues and blacks and very dark and rather somber, moving into the rose period that was much warmer. And so this is kind of in the middle of that transition, which makes it interesting from a subject matter perspective and a palette perspective, color scheme perspective. I've got some images of Picasso at that time as a young man, trying to make a name for himself. Here he is. You can see the date up there, 1904. So it puts us right in the wheelhouse of this golden age of the Lapin Agile. And you should know that Picasso and his entourage, or the Bande à Picasso, Picasso's clan, his group that traveled around with him, always ended up at the Lapin Agile. They would paint, and work at the Bateau Lavoir, and then migrate over to the Lapin Agile to wind down up. I say wind down, but they were winding up in some respects. So this is a rather known image, but I came across researching this episode another image of Picasso that I didn't know about and I love. Check out how studly he is and how Parisian he looks here. I love it. This is around the same time. He was a good looking guy. My gut tells me that this was taken right on the edge of the square where the Bateau Lavoir is. So the Bateau Lavoir would be at our backs over here. And then there's a pharmacy, for those of you who know the area, there's a pharmacy on the corner here. And then the Sacré-Cœur would be further up the hill, up there. This building is no longer there, but I've compared it with the street view on Google, and I believe this building is exactly the same today. And the way this street slants down. So my instincts, my gut tells me that that's where he was, right on the edge. And there's a Wallace fountain nowadays right here, too. But look at that. I wish I could look that good, strutting my stuff on the streets of Paris. Mark says the guitar player is wearing Crocs. That's just how hip he was, Mark. So during this time, 1904, 1905, blue period into the rose period, Picasso also painted, because he was hanging out so much at this cabaret, painted the stepdaughter of Frye, the manager. And this is called Woman with a Crow. It was never hanging on the walls of the Lapin Agile, but I wanted to show you because it's related to Frye's family, again, as his stepdaughter. And when we talk about the transition from blue period to rose period, this is visually really the best way you could look at it, with the blue and the red in the same composition. And I mean, what can you say about Picasso? I love this period that was still very representational. This was before he dove full headlong into Cubism. So things are still very representational, but what he did clearly here is it's called Woman with a Crow, and with her elongated fingers representing the talons and her shoulders and her arms morphing into essentially wings, really shows the melding of these two forms of the female form and the bird. And in fact, I think, my interpretation, is that even he intentionally made the line of this arm blend seamlessly into the body of the crow, really shows us that he's trying to get across the fact that they are one and the same, and they're blending together. Just beautiful. These are the Picasso paintings that I could stare at all day long. So he painted this at the same time of a member of Frye's family. Back to this painting. Either Picasso in 1905 paid for a meal, or he exchanged it for a meal because he couldn't pay, or he just gave it as a gift to the cabaret and hung it, as I said, himself on the walls, and it was there for many, many years. It is a self-portrait of him, And this is Frye himself. This is the Frye with his guitar and the Crocs. There you go, Mark. Maybe he's wearing the Crocs or the clogs in this image as well. And we'll talk about who the woman is in this image in a moment, because she is related to another fun fact that I think some of you will be delighted by if you know Montmartre. So this is meant to be Picasso. This is a harlequin. This is a circus performer. And you would have seen these types of outfits in the circus all the time in Paris and in the outskirts of Paris, where the traveling circuses would come through, and the sort of nomadic tribes of performers. And what is essentially a very Napoleonic hat, we'd have to admit. I don't know, maybe there's a bit of psychology happening there too. Some of you may have heard this painting was the original Picasso hanging for many years, and then one day a tourist comes through and offers to Frye, the manager, I would like to buy this off of you. I love this painting. Let me pay you for it. And Frye said, all right, but I have no idea about the value of this painting, so how about you give me $20 US? This was during World War I. And so this original Picasso hanging on the walls of the Lapin Agile sold for $20 back then, which, as I understand it, I'm no currency expert, but I believe that's a roughly $500 in today's currency, if you factor in inflation. So for the equivalent of $500 back then, and then later on Picasso came in and he saw his painting was no longer there, and Frye said, yeah, I sold it. And he's like, oh no, you sold it too soon, you should have held on to it. Sure enough, fast forward to the 1980s in New York, the same painting, bought for $20, is auctioned off for $42 million. So there you go. I like to tell that story when I'm giving a tour. So next, this woman here, I said that we would mention her. Her name she was one of the favorite models of Picasso, and also they had a romantic relationship that evolved into a lifelong friendship. And her name was Laure Germaine. Laure Germaine was one of those women who would hang out with artists, who would befriend them, who was a beautiful woman that people tended to all fall in love with, and they would vie for her attention, certainly vie for her participation in their studios as a model. And so what's interesting is not only was she painted by Picasso several times and a friend of his, but around this time that this was painted, she and her husband, a friend of Picasso's, also an artist, purchased another building right up the street. And it was this. This is the same woman, Laure Germaine, with her husband, artist husband, friend of Picasso, in the window. And La Maison Rose, I know many of you know it. So they purchased this in around 1905, as I understand. And we're running the little restaurant out of the bottom here. So that's exciting. Not only did she purchase the Maison Rose, but it became pink. It's famously pink, for those of you who don't know. La Maison Rose, meaning the pink house. The reason it's pink is apparently because of Laure Germaine. She and her Spanish husband were traveling through Spain, and she fell in love, as the story goes, with the colorful facades of those Spanish towns, and she decided to come back and paint their location here pink. So that's some trivia for you. Thanks, Billy Godso, for the support in the chat. I really appreciate that. Back to my images, trying to frantically document the interiors of the space before the show started. Can catch just a little one half of that Picasso painting here. It's a shame. I almost wish I could come here during the day, during off hours, and turn the lights on and get a good look at all of this stuff. This is fun. This is a painting above the doorway where you enter. And clearly you can see the Christ there. This is a representation of the interior. Peggy asks an interesting question. She says, Corey, where in this room did the girls dance? Well, Peggy, that's the thing. We're going to touch upon the fact that this is a cabaret, a French cabaret in the very original sense, in that there are no dancing girls, in fact. It's not a Moulin Rouge type of cabaret. It's more of it's a very low-key affair, where basically drinking and performance in a very low-key manner. This was an interesting image, and I didn't catch who the artist was, but I like it. Very well done. Certainly thought-provoking, and you're like, oh, okay, well, that's a little glimpse into what the vibe would have been like at the Lapin Agile on certain evenings. This is fun too. This is a Suzanne Valadon piece. I talked about her also when we talked about the hidden studio in the Montmartre Museum. Suzanne Valadon was the mother of Maurice Utrillo. And that was fun to recognize her work. Definitely check out my previous episode of her Valadon studio in the Montmartre Museum. This is an image on the wall by an artist named Poulbeau. If you start digging into the history of Montmartre, you certainly come across this artist's name. He was a lesser known than the big names, but locally he was a big deal and very prevalent and very influential. So that's Poulbeau. Thanks, Adriano. Interesting story as always, Adriano says. And then this is fun. I recognize this right away, and I'll tell you why in a minute, but this is by Toulouse-Lautrec. And Toulouse-Lautrec did a couple of famous portraits of this cabaret singer by the name of Aristide Bruant. He was a singer of all the big cabarets, notably the Chat Noir, the black cat that so many of us like to fantasize about. And so this version was hanging, signed here, Toulouse-Lautrec. Now, is this an original printing or did it happen years after? It's kind of hard to know. I didn't get a chance to ask anybody. But just for fun, we'll assume that it was an original printing. It's actually signed, it's hard to make out here, but signed by Bruant himself, this performer. The reason this character who I didn't know at all, I didn't know about him before I moved to Paris, or before I came to Paris, is this famous poster done by Toulouse-Lautrec also, of the same guy, and you can see his name there, Aristide. Such a cool name, isn't it? Aristide. I had never heard of that before I came here. This happens to be one of the exact souvenirs that I bought in some shop when I visited Paris for the first time as a tourist, and I brought it home with me, and I thought it was the coolest thing ever. I had no idea what it was, but for me it was so emblematic of coming to Paris for the first time and walking through Montmartre and just being absolutely consumed by the magic of the cabaret history. So I brought this little poster home with me, and I put it on the wall of my bedroom right next to my computer in New York. And I looked at it year after year while I was starting to fall in love with my future French wife and dreaming of what it would be like to move to France. This was accompanying me. So that's why it was really fun to come across this image of Aristide Bruant by Toulouse-Lautrec. Thanks, Laura West, for the support. It says, wonderful tour today, Corey. I'm learning so much. Thanks, Laura. That's part of the goal for sure. So then the concert started, which began with just the pianist coming out and playing some instrumentals to get everybody warmed up. And this is an interesting way to explain the fact that because the space is so small, this curtain is pulled aside, and this is actually where you enter the room. So a bit further back, you can't see, but around the corner, this is the main entrance. And then you come in and you give your ticket. There are a couple of rooms here with the guitars and the pots and pans that I showed you. And then you come through here. And then once the show officially starts and all the stragglers have made their way in, they close this curtain and it becomes the stage. So Peggy Baker, that's a little bit of an answer to, well, where do they fit all the dancing girls? Well, there are no dancing girls, and there's actually not even a stage. So that it's a cabaret in the very, very old school definition. And like I said, Erik Satie, the famous, brilliant composer, would have spent time here and would have played probably a similar piano in a similar spot. So this is what most of the performances look like. There is a caveat that we were here on a brutally cold December night, and it was a Tuesday. So obviously, Friday night, Saturday night, middle of the summer, this is probably a different atmosphere. But as you can see, almost nobody was here. There were a few people sitting over here on the left. There were maybe like 8 or 9 or 10 of us total, all along the edges of the walls. And one by one, performers would come through the curtain and perform. This starts at 9 p.m. roughly, and then goes on until 1 a.m., 2 a.m., perhaps, depending on the crowd, probably goes even later. And it's kind of understood that you're allowed to leave whenever you've had enough, because most people aren't expected to sit there for 5 hours. But as long as you wait until one performer is finished and they go out through the curtain, and then that's your you know, your time to exit if you wish. But what is odd is that, let's say it's midnight or 1 a.m. and you decide you do want to leave, you've got to exit directly through the stage, essentially, which is rather unique as far as venues go. Thanks, Sandra Hendricks. Appreciate the support in the chat. As things get going, and I will play you a video clip that I snuck. I really didn't want to be the guy who was whipping out my phone and making recordings, so I tried to be very discreet. A lot of my photos and videos I took were of trying to hide under the table. But I'll play you a video clip so you can hear what this guy sounded like. But as the show is kind of unraveling, they bring out a tray of this house cocktail. And I don't remember the name of it, and I don't remember all the details, but I do remember that it was, I think it was a cherry liqueur-based alcoholic drink. So this is the one drink that's included in the 28 euro admission price. And it was damn good, let me tell you. This is mine. And again, you got to imagine this is, you know, bright red lighting and a very deep, rich red cocktail that you're drinking. It was yummy. This also shows us the fact that the tables have been around a while and are all etched in with various bits of graffiti over the years of, I would assume, audience members. And this is what, as far as I can understand, what most of the tables look like. Just if it might interest you, I rotated this image to see some of the names. No famous names, you know, you won't see any like Lautrex in there or any Auguste Renoir, but you can see here's someone named Irene or Irene. Here's an Et, that was probably someone like Odette or Annette. Here is a name, if you can make it out, Jeannot, Fifi, etc., etc. David Dubois says, Corey, that drink might have been cassis. Yeah, although cassis is made out of red currant or black currant, one of the currants. And so this one was specifically cherry, and it had some sort of historical link back to the days of old. This was my view. When I wasn't looking at the performer to the right, this was my view of the center. And it's just very indicative of that same table that we saw in the center of that old black and white image of Frye and his crew. So here is a shot I snuck from under the table. It was very dark. It's actually a miracle that I could get any of these photos to work. So it was different singers. Again, this was a Tuesday night, so maybe they're not bringing out the big guns, but a few different singers. I think there was someone came out and read some texts or poetry, and you know, a violinist would come out, etc. The pianist would come in and out according to what was going on. Sometimes the pianist would just play solo, etc. So that kind of gives you an idea of the vibe, and it's very chill. Even though the guy was belting out these tunes, I'm going to play you the video of a clip here so you can get an idea. But it's very chill, you know, you're chatting with folks. There's kind of the murmur of conversation under the performances, and people are drinking. Now you get that one free drink that's included, but then there are menus on the tables, paper menus, that will allow you to order other types of drinks, champagne, etc., other cocktails that you can choose to do throughout the night, which I guess that's one regret that I had, is that I should have just gone for it. You know, it was a cold, blustery December night. I should have just lubed myself up something good, but I was with my mother-in-law and her friends, and which actually made this really fun and authentic, because they were all a generation ahead of me, and a little bit more, I felt, connected to the glory days of these sing-along cabarets and the gangettes. And none of them spoke English, so of course it was 100% French-speaking night, and that helped to add to the authenticity. I didn't feel too much like a tourist. So let me go ahead and play you a clip of this video. Hopefully the sound will come through, and I'll just let it run and give you the idea of the general vibe. No, let's skip this version. Sorry about that. Here we go. This is what I want to do. Here we go. Okay, hopefully that worked out with no technical glitches. And that gives you a fun idea of the vibe. Very traditional, very stylized. You know, a lot of vibrato of, you know, a lot of that, a lot of big booming, belting sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? You know, just like real old-fashioned crooner style. And not all of the music was like that, but a lot of it was. And so that is essentially, if you're ever wondering what a rather classic old world French cabaret would have felt like, I think this gives us at least some idea of that. Thanks in the meantime to some support I got from David Dubois. I appreciate that, buddy. Good to have you here. And Sue Saint Laurent. I love that name. Saint Laurent. Yeah, Kathleen says here in the live chat that it's rather operatic, for sure. We've got Sojourner Truth says, hey, Corey, I read where Edith Piaf was a regular performer here during the 1930s. Too bad patrons didn't have cell phone cameras back then to film her. Yeah. Nexus Server says Satie worked as an accompanist in server of the cafes around Paris. Okay, I can't quite make in server of the cafes around Paris. Oh, several. Okay, so he was an accompanist, accompanying people in several of the cafes around Paris and wrote songs that were performed there. Thanks, Nexus Sever. Sorry, I completely botched your comment. Thanks, Ricky, for the support. It says, lovely presentation, Corey. Merci. So onward. Getting towards the end here. But the idea, yeah, is this goes on for hours and hours with different performers and different types of music, and maybe on certain evenings you get different types of acting performances, I'm not sure. But very small stage, very low key, very, very old school. I think the current owner that you saw when we entered, the gentleman at the front, is very content to keep this as authentic and old school as possible. So here back to our turn of the century image of the outside. We stayed, by the way, until about 1 a.m. So it was, let's see, Saturday at 9. So after 4 hours of that, it was like, all right, we've got our fill. And I really wonder how many people stay till the bitter end, because it must go, at least in the summer, when there's a good crowd, it must go really into the wee hours. So anyway, in conclusion, the World War I would come along, and of course, like almost everything else, it would mark the beginning of the end of this heyday, of this golden era of the Lapin Agile, and really Montmartre in general, as far as being the artistic hub. World War I really marked the turn of the creative hub of Paris, moving from Montmartre down to Montparnasse. Interestingly, it would be World War II that would move the creatives from Montparnasse to Saint-Germain-des-Prés. I'm not saying there was necessarily a direct correlation, but it seemed those breaks of the two world wars was a way for the creative characters of Paris to switch neighborhoods. I'm sure that's another thing we could get into at another time. But even after that, after World War I, for example, you still had a lot of iconic creative artistic moments at the Lapin Agile. It still bounced back for sure to a certain extent. Frequented by a lot of artists, famously Charlie Chaplin, who came through here several times when he was staying in Paris. He was a big fan of the Lapin Agile. He would come to listen to the music and to watch the performances, but sometimes, of course, would jump up and perform himself or grab Frye's violin and perform a bit. In fact, I came across this newspaper article from 1930, and it says Au Lapin Agile with Bill Bucket and Charlot, Charlot being the very common French nickname for Charlie Chaplin. And this is an image of Chaplin without a mustache, which is very interesting. I'm so used to seeing him with the stash. So he came through in the 20s and 30s, as I understand it. Also, we can move a little bit further into the 60s. There was a fun black and white movie called Paris Blues, starring Paul Newman, Sidney Poitier. The female lead is someone's gonna have to help me. I forget. I'm gonna have to Google that real quick. But this is a scene. I'm sorry. I just got to check. It's gonna drive me crazy. Woodward was her name. Joanne Woodward. Yeah, Joanne Woodward and Paul Newman. Now I apologize for the blurry image here, because you can actually view this. I got this off YouTube. The entire film Paris Blues is on YouTube for free, but it's a rather low resolution. But if you don't mind the 420p resolution, I highly recommend you watch this. It's really fun. It's filmed on location, and you can see Newman and Woodward here walking in front of the Lapin Agile. And what's fun about this scene is they meet. It's the back of Sidney Poitier and the female lead that plays his love interest, and they are walking in front of the Lapin Agile. In fact, if you're able to see with eagle eyes, this is a sign that says Lapin Agile there, filmed on location. So that's called Paris Blues. You might want to check it out for you die-hard Paris fans. 1961 it was filmed. It's about two American jazz musicians who come across these two women who are tourists traveling through, and they spend time together, and there's a lot of jazz music, and I believe I think Louis Armstrong is part of the story. I think he makes an appearance. It's been a little while since I watched it. Thanks for the support. Nancy Burson, appreciate that. And Peggy Baker says, I always feel smarter after your French classes. Merci as always, and thanks for the song. Oh, you're welcome, Peggy. I hope you're having a lovely birthday. I don't know if today is the actual day, but at any rate. And then one last little bit of history here. Steve Martin wrote a play that was fictionally, hypothetically based inside the Lapin Agile, and it was called Picasso at the Lapin Agile, and written by comedian actor Steve Martin in 1993. The play is about a fictional meeting of Picasso and Albert Einstein, just as Einstein was developing his theory of relativity and Picasso was developing his ideas about cubism, and it's the idea of what if they both met in this cafe and they discussed philosophies and life views and whatnot. So it is, this is a poster from a theater in Houston that a few years ago put on a production. It's just, it pops up here and there across the country of small theater productions putting on performances of this, but also interesting to note. So the Lapin Agile has a long history that is still pervading history every few decades or so. And I think that is going to do it for us. I feel very fortunate that I was finally able to get to attend a show inside. And it'll always be one of those really fun, special memories of my time in Paris, I'm sure, for the rest of my life. Angie's asking what the movie name was. Paris Blues. 1961, if I'm not mistaken. Oh, thanks, Agios or Agios in the comments. Says Joanne Woodward was Paul Newman's wife. Thank you. I am not knowledgeable enough in that period of film history. I would have never known that in 1,000 years. So thanks so much for that. I appreciate it. That's really fun. Rachel Wyatt's also educating me that that was Paul Newman's wife. That makes it even cooler, doesn't it? So there we are, folks. That's gonna do it. We're at just about the 1 hour mark. That was a fun one. I personally enjoyed sharing this with you. I hope you did too. If you have any other lovers of French history or art history out there, be sure to share this with them. Shout out to Sue-Ann Hum. I didn't see you, Sue-Ann, necessarily in the live chat. I'm not sure if you're here live or on the replay, but shout out to you, who's one of our very artistic, painterly freaks. And I think we'll wrap things up there. Thanks, Bonnie Turbeville. I see your support there in the chats. Very much support. Very much appreciated. Let's not drag out this goodbye like I always do. If you are a current Patreon supporter, you can pop over in a few minutes into our Facebook group, the Cafe Chats group. I got some wine and chocolate and cheese and treats lined up for us to just have a little chat out in the garden, out in the old backyard. And I want to thank you all for joining me. I look forward to sharing another episode with you soon, 117 it will be. And we'll likely, if it's not going to rain, we'll likely be out on the streets again. Maybe we'll do another bike ride. So thanks. Take care. Hope you enjoyed this one. Keep those Paris dreams alive. Paris is becoming more and more of a possibility to all of you with every day that goes by. So fingers crossed for that. And I hope to see many of you in person on the streets of Paris. All right. Take care, everybody. Have a lovely rest of your day. And I will catch you on the next episode.